study the patterns of the universe.
Advancement in the brain.
Your mind. Talking about your life. Fundamental principles.
Philosophy.
What is and what is not true.
Those who know themselves.
Being better every single day.
Okay, well, howdy there, partners. This is the Think Grow podcast. Welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Ruben Chavez, and I explore a variety of topics with thought leaders, creators, entrepreneurs, researchers, and all sorts of interesting people with the goal to bring you different perspectives you can use to enrich your mind and improve your life in whatever way you see fit. So today, I want to talk with you one-on-one here about an idea that I've been kicking around in my head recently, and I wrote a few blog posts about this idea, but I wanted to do an episode here to tie it all together and hopefully make it that much more impactful and useful for you. I've been into personal development or self-help or personal growth, however you want to conceptualize it. I've been into this field for a long time. I was introduced at like 18 years old, and ever since then, I started out reading books like Think and Grow Rich and The Magic of Thinking Big and How to Win Friends and Influence People, these kind of core, fundamental, classic books. And they've really shaped the way I view the world and the way I think about things and the way I view myself and relate to people. And so I've been immersed in this sea of self-help for a long time. And I've recently kind of stepped back and been thinking about it from a more objective standpoint, because there's this tendency to get overwhelmed with too much information. And that's not good, because then you get confused. And then if you're confused, you don't actually apply or use any of the information that you consumed. And so, I felt myself going down that path to a degree. And I've seen other people in that same boat. And so I just wanted to kind of address that from a broader perspective, because there is this tendency to think that there are far more ideas and concepts than there really are in this field. And like if you go to a bookstore and look at the self-help section, there's like hundreds of books. And within the books, thousands upon thousands of different principles, concepts, strategies, tactics, etc. for living well. Because ultimately that's kind of what this field aims to do, is like help you to conduct yourself properly in the world, live a better life, improve yourself, improve your relationships, that kind of a thing. And so it can get overwhelming if you think that these are all distinct pieces of information that are unrelated to each other, because then there are like thousands upon thousands. And this isn't just in self-help, by the way, like psychology, religion, philosophy. These are also fields that offer some insights for how to live, and also fields where you can potentially get overwhelmed if you don't know how to properly organize all the information that you're consuming. Right? And so, you hear all of this stuff like meditate, be more productive, journal, live in the now, like love thy neighbor, be more assertive, be grateful for what you have. Like there's all these approaches, and they all make sense to a degree. But my issue has been that I really want some kind of framework for how to conceptualize this information, rather than just trying to hold all these different pieces of advice in my mind at all times. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about here, because I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. I hate feeling overwhelmed, like when I'm reading a book or when I'm listening to a lecture. And the way that you don't be overwhelmed is you have to have some context for what it is that you're learning, what it is that you're consuming. And then that will help you place it in your mind a little bit more efficiently. So let me just throw this idea out there. What if there are far fewer self-improvement principles than we think there are? Like, there appear to be endless pieces of advice, as I've already kind of discussed, but the truth is there's a lot of overlap between seemingly different ideas. So if you think of like the field of productivity, there might be 200 books on productivity, each with 20 pieces of advice. But that doesn't mean that there are 2,000 distinct productivity principles. It just means that the same idea is probably expressed in different ways across different books and through different lenses and through different frameworks. And so you can have the same idea show up in many different forms. So what's the best way to organize all of this information in order to make sense of it all? Well, one way, I don't know if it's the best way, but it is one way that I've come up with, is through this framework that I created that I call the ABCs of self-development. I'll have to come up with a better name at some point, but right now that's what it's called. And the ABCs refer to the three categories that make up the framework, which I'll tell you right now. And then I'll go into depth on each one. So the three categories are pay attention, get clarity, maintain balance. So attention, clarity, balance. A, C, B. Kind of out of order, but still works for ABCs. On their own, these probably don't mean much to you. But what these are these are kind of, I think of them as meta principles or categories or overarching principles that point to these really deep truths that are embedded in so much of the advice and strategies and concepts that you read about, right? So they're really like at the root of all of these other ideas that we think are different. They kind of unify them, okay? And let's take the first category, which is pay attention. So each of these categories has kind of an essence to it, kind of a core set of words that describe it. For pay attention, it has to do with becoming aware, observing, noticing, and focusing. These are kind of the vibe of this particular meta principle. And so there's a ton of wisdom packed into this phrase, pay attention. It turns out that a lot of our problems can be solved simply by paying more attention. And like I said, this principle takes many different forms and is expressed in many different ways, but it really is the fundamental idea behind many important self-developmental concepts, as are the other meta principles. So I'll give you an example. Meditation is essentially about paying attention to your breath or to the present moment or to your body sensations, depending on what meditation philosophy you're into. The same could be said about mindfulness in general, right? So mindfulness is about paying attention to reality as it is now, to what you're doing or thinking at this very moment. When people say be more present, that's what they're talking about. They're saying pay more attention to this moment. Okay, so meditation, mindfulness, that's all wrapped up in pay attention. Let's take another concept, gratitude. What's gratitude? Gratitude is paying attention to the good things in your life. If you're ungrateful, you're not noticing, you're not being aware of the good in your life, right? So gratitude requires constant awareness because our brains have a tendency to take things for granted. And this is what leads to the hedonic treadmill that Stoicism talks about and that shows up in psychology. To be a good listener, right? This is another concept. To be a good listener in conversation, the most important thing you can do is what? Pay attention. Pay attention to what the other person is saying. Pay attention to their facial expressions, to other social cues, their body language. Like paying attention in this way will make you an excellent listener and conversationalist. It's going to help you respond in the most effective way. Also, paying attention in social interactions decreases social anxiety, it's been shown, because you're able to better gauge what other people are thinking when you're looking at their face. and looking at their expressions and body language. Okay, let's take another concept that is talked about a lot, the concept of self-awareness, right? Self-awareness is fundamentally about paying attention to the positive and the negative aspects of yourself, paying attention to what you're good at, what you're not good at, paying attention to how you affect others. You can also think of self-awareness as kind of observing yourself from a third-party perspective. So again, the awareness, the observation aspect, the attention aspect, these are all wrapped up in this concept. Emotional intelligence is another idea that is talked about in personal development a lot. And emotional intelligence is simply paying attention to your emotions and noticing them arise before they get out of control so that you can respond to them intelligently and so that you can use them productively. And not just in yourself, but in others. Okay, so let's just do a couple more because this is fun. And you can see how these are coming together, right? Okay, so effective learning. Let's talk about learning. To learn something effectively and to recall it, you really have to pay close attention to the information you're consuming. Of course, if you've ever gotten to the end of a page in a book and spaced out and didn't remember what you were reading, you weren't paying attention to the information. You also weren't present. You also weren't mindful, which is another form of paying attention. I've had Jim Quick on the podcast, who's a memory coach and learning expert. And he says that learning isn't so much an issue of retention as it is an issue of attention. So that's really interesting. Okay, what's another one? Managing anxiety. There are many different ways to manage anxiety, or at least several different ways to manage anxiety. But one of them is learning to pay attention to what you can control as opposed to what you can't. So, your brain really constructs your reality based on what you're paying attention to at any given moment. And if you learn to manage and direct your focus, you really can improve any area of your life. And so learning to place your attention where it's most productive is a really useful skill to have. And then finally, the concept of deep work. That's a really interesting one. Deep work is basically prolonged concentration. If you haven't heard of the book Deep Work, it's by Cal Newport. Really good book. I recommend checking it out. But that's the ability to pay attention to a task at hand to the exclusion of all other distractions. That's what deep work is. That's what prolonged concentration is. And so what's the opposite of that? Well, you have something like ADHD, which is the inability to pay attention for any sustained period of time. You can see how these things are kind of related, right? These are all under the banner of pay attention. They're all under that category, that meta principle of pay attention. There are many more principles and concepts and ideas within this category, but these are just a few to kind of represent what pay attention is. So hopefully you have a better idea of that. Now I'm going to move on to the second category, or overarching principle or meta principle, which is get clarity. What does get clarity mean? Well, the process of getting clarity can take many different forms. So generally, this category has to do with defining, identifying, making distinctions, has to do with drawing boundaries, reframing, and getting perspective. So these are kind of the core words here. These are the essence of this category. So here are a few ways this principle manifests itself in self-development and philosophy and psychology even. So let's take an example from psychology. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. This is one of the most effective forms of therapy, actually. It has the highest success rate, has one of the highest success rates of any form of therapy. And essentially, it's all about identifying negative thoughts and reframing them through a more rational lens in order to get clarity or perspective, right? And so doing this involves getting clear on what it is that you're thinking, getting clear on your thoughts, like actually sorting them out. That whole process is the process of getting clarity. Let's take another one. This is a really basic self-developmental concept, which is setting goals. Setting goals is fundamentally about getting clarity on what you want to accomplish, right? So when you're goal-oriented, it means that you've identified what's important to you and made that clear. And once you have clarity on what matters, then you know what action to take. So, this is where the saying, you can't score if you don't have a goal, comes in. That quote points to this principle of getting clarity. Let's see, what else? Finding your why. You always hear find your why, meaning get clear on what your reason is for doing something. What's your true, deepest motivation behind your actions? You have to get clear on that. That's what finding your why is about. So here's another way to improve your peace of mind and kind of decrease anxiety is clarifying the problem in your mind. Being clear on what it is that your problem is actually very useful. In fact, that's what a good therapist or psychologist should do, is to help you sort your thoughts out and get clarity on your circumstances, not impart some new wisdom onto you necessarily. So when you define your worries and you define your problems, you help minimize them, because known monsters are less scary than unknown monsters, right? We're scared of what's lurking in the darkness. And so if you leave your worries and your anxieties unexpressed and undefined, it makes them seem more overwhelming than they actually are. And so this is a principle that shows up in psychology a lot. It's like, get clarity on the problem and bring them to the surface, essentially. Okay, so here's another one, and it's kind of related to that one. It is an idea in Stoicism that modern authors have kind of given the name negative visualization. And what that is that basically it's about defining the worst case scenario. And what this does is it helps to kind of take the pressure off and put your mind at ease in the present. Because if you don't have it, if you don't know what the worst case scenario is, if you don't define your fears for the future, then you're going to be more anxious than you need to be. And so it helps with that, but it also helps increase your gratitude for what you have. If you picture losing something, and if you get clear on what you would feel like having lost something that you value, you're more grateful for it in the present. So, and also likewise, when you get clarity on what you're actually scared of, your fears become less scary. Okay, so here's another one. Drawing boundaries. This is an idea that shows up in relationship psychology and therapy and things like that. Drawing boundaries in relationships is how you help others gain clarity about how to treat you. So this is a useful thing to do with your friends and your family and peers, partners, authority figures, and even children, especially children who you're raising that have no sense of boundaries yet. Boundaries is just clear communication about, so on your side, it's clear communication about how to treat you, but also on the other end, it's helping people get clarity about how to treat you. Here's another one, being organized. Or the idea of organization is basically summed up with getting clarity. It's having well-defined physical boundaries between items. If you think about that, like if you're organizing a drawer or something, the way you do that is you create better boundaries, more well-defined boundaries between items. You put items in little baskets and then you bundle them together and you stack them. And so there's better boundaries there. So that's kind of a funny one, but it's true. Okay, so next one, working productively. Working productively it involves clearly identifying your mission critical tasks for the day and then doing them, right? So if you are a productive worker and if you approach your day effectively, you know you're very clear on what it is that you have to do that day and you execute that. That's very simple. It's getting clarity on the most important things you have to do. So we talked about effective learning in the previous category, pay attention, but it also falls into this category because effective learning is also characterized by making distinctions and getting clarity on specific ideas and concepts. So that's a really important aspect of learning. And then finally, let's take another kind of relationship-based idea, which is disagreement and resolving disagreements. In order to do that, you really need to have clarity on the other person's argument. You need to deconstruct the other person's argument so you know the specific points of disagreement. This is really the first step to resolving a dispute. So the more clarity you have about why you're disagreeing with someone, the finer resolution you have on the other person's point of view, and of course, the more likely you are to resolve the disagreement. Without clarity, there can be no solution. Get clarity. Again, there are many different examples here that I could talk about under the category get clarity. These are just a few of the initial ones that popped into my head as I was thinking about this topic and writing the blog post and kind of forming my notes around this idea. But I think these will serve to communicate each category to you effectively, hopefully. On this show, I often focus on the mental and emotional aspects of living well, but physical health is just as important. You can't think, grow, or prosper to the fullest unless you have your health in check. Four Sigmatic products have really helped me with this part of my life. There are very few companies whose products I recommend without reservation, but Four Sigmatic is definitely one of them. I've been using their superfood supplements for years, long before they became a sponsor of this podcast. Four Sigmatic specializes in mushroom-based drinks that promote immunity, energy, longevity, and just help us live all-around healthier lives. As far as what I'd recommend, they make a wide variety of different blends, but there's two that I'll recommend to you. The first is their Coffee with Cordyceps blend. Cordyceps is a medicinal mushroom, and it's been shown to support energy, stamina, and athletic performance, so it's perfect before a workout or during a study session or anytime you need some extra focus. And all their coffee is 100% organic, and it actually tastes like coffee, not like mushrooms in case you were worried. The second product I'll recommend is probably my favorite supplement I've taken in a very long time. It's not a coffee blend, it's actually a blend of 10 different adaptogenic herbs. What are adaptogenic herbs? In a nutshell, they are plants that have been traditionally consumed, often for thousands of years, to help people adapt to various forms of stress. They help minimize fatigue, promote focus, and just increase general well-being. So I've been mixing this blend into my morning smoothies for a while now, and I've been amazed by how balanced it makes me feel. Cognitively, I'm sharper, I can work for longer periods of time, and I just generally have more energy. As a listener of the Think Grow podcast, you can get 15% off any Four Sigmatic purchase by going to foursigmatic.com/TGP. They've also been kind enough to set up a discount code for you guys. So just type in the letters TGP, as in Think Grow Prosper, at checkout, and you'll get 15% off your order. So again, that URL you want to visit for the discount is foursigmatic.com, all spelled out, /TGP. Or just use discount code TGP at checkout to get 15% off your order. And now, back to the show. Okay, let's move on to the last category, or meta principle, which is maintain balance. And this one's a little bit more difficult to describe than the other two categories. It has a lot of nuance to it, and it's also very ubiquitous. Like, how do you explain water to a fish, right? It's such a part of our lives that it's almost difficult to identify. But in a nutshell, maintain balance has to do with balancing opposing forces in order to establish harmony. So it's characterized by, in one sense, equilibrium, but in another sense, it's also characterized by paradox. And I'll kind of try to explain what I mean by that. But in many ways, this is, like I said, it's such a part of our world that it's axiomatic. Like it describes how the world is ordered. It describes the natural rhythm of things. So it's almost self-evident in many ways. It's the philosophy represented by the yin-yang symbol. So here are a few examples of the aspect of this principle that points to equilibrium. So self-development. Self-development as a whole is largely about balancing different aspects of your personality. On this podcast, I've spoken about personality before and the psychology of personality and temperament. And if you think of personality as, well, for example, in the Big Five personality model, if you think of it as 5 distinct traits, 5 overarching traits that each exist on a spectrum, and that you can slide up and down on each of the traits to kind of make your unique combination of traits that make you who you are. So self-development is basically adjusting the traits as necessary. Oh, you're not very conscientious. You're not very hardworking by nature. Well, work on having a better work ethic. Maybe you're disagreeable and abrasive by nature. And well, in that case, your self-development homework would be to practice emotional intelligence and develop people skills. That's going to help smooth out your edges. So it's balancing the different aspects of your personality that might be underdeveloped or overdeveloped. Okay, so another one would be harmonious relationships. Building and creating harmonious relationships happens when you meet someone who balances you out. So if you're an overly neurotic person, a friend who is more emotionally stable, let's say, will help counterbalance your neuroticism. And if you're introverted, you're likely to choose a romantic partner who is more extroverted. Otherwise, you're not going to have anything to talk about. And so these are kind of like really self-evident things, but they are manifestations of this meta principle of maintaining balance. A lot of this we do intuitively without even thinking. Another example is like who you are, the person that you are. And I mean the definable person that you are, the person that we can see, not like consciousness or anything, but the person that how you show up in the world is the result of the interplay between two opposing forces, nature and nurture. It's the balance between those forces. The creation of life itself occurs through the union of two opposing energies, masculine and feminine. It's the balance of that, right? And so here's another example. The way that our brain operates is by balancing two primary systems, which are emotion and reason. Emotion and reason are the primary operating systems in our brain. And although these seem to work at cross purposes, they're actually two sides of the same coin, and they balance each other out. And both are necessary for optimal brain functioning. Here's another one. This is more cultural or societal, let's say. A functioning society is the result of a well-balanced political system. So, for example, you can take the bipartisan political system here in the West, which isn't perfect, but it does balance two different worldviews, two different ways of thinking about the world. For example, broadly speaking, the political left is concerned with challenging and changing current social structures, especially the ones that put certain groups at a disadvantage. The political right, on the other hand, is concerned with maintaining those social structures and institutions, especially those which they believe will cause undue disorder in society if disrupted. So both sides of the spectrum are necessary in order to maintain a functioning society. Because a country whose political left remains unchallenged becomes unstable and chaotic because order could never be established, right? But then on the other side, a country whose political right is left unchecked would eventually become stagnant and corrupt because they would be unwilling to change and to adapt. So that's another example of the balance between opposites, the balance between opposing forces. Okay, so here's one last example in the equilibrium category, which is cultivating physical health. Cultivating health is a matter of maintaining balance, or as it's called in this field, homeostasis, between different systems of the body. And that's achieved through a proper balance of diet and lifestyle, right? So that's another manifestation that's fairly self-evident, but it's also very deep. It's very ingrained into our world. So now I'm going to end with kind of the paradoxical aspect of maintaining balance, because there's also this expression of this principle that has to do with paradox, and that has to do with things that seemingly contradict each other, but actually balance each other out. So, for instance, there's this idea in the spiritual world, let's say, that has been around for a very long time. It's one of the oldest spiritual principles put forth by Taoism, Buddhism, and modern teachers like Eckhart Tolle, etc. And it's this idea that what you resist persists, and what you accept, you transcend. So like by accepting something, you transcend it, you change it when you accept it, right? You not only change it, but you go beyond it. And that's a counterintuitive idea, but it's something that is embedded into a lot of different teachings. So you can think of it kind of like water also, because water doesn't resist things. It kind of goes around them, but it has unbelievable power. You know, it shaped the Grand Canyon. This idea is actually sometimes more concretely represented in fiction works. So like even Harry Potter, right? The devil's snare in Harry Potter, that's a magical plant that constricts and strangles anything that touches it. And if you struggle against it, if you resist it, when you're in the grip of the devil's snare, it only causes the plant to constrict even tighter. It grabs you even tighter. And then only when you relax does it release you. So it's kind of this leaning into it, leaning into struggle, accepting it, and by doing so, transcending it. Okay, here's another one. The idea that challenges help you grow. That's a paradox too, but it's profoundly true. I mean, this is even true in something like bodybuilding or weightlifting. Like if you want your muscle to grow, you have to challenge it. You have to break it down in order for it to get stronger. And so this shows up in personal development and in psychology all the time. The very thing standing in your way is actually the key to moving forward, right? This is kind of the obstacle is the way. Shout out to Ryan Holiday, who's also been on the podcast. And so in psychology, you can look at exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is a behavior therapy that's used for treating anxiety disorders, right? And patients are exposed to the very source of their anxiety. But what happens is not only do they stop being afraid of the thing that they were afraid of or anxious about, they become more courageous. So you can think of it as maybe the darkness of the unknown is balanced with the light of awareness. They become so aware of their fear that they transcend it. So that kind of relates to the what you accept, you transcend thing. Here's some other ways of phrasing this principle. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Every adversity carries with it the seed of success. Face your fears. And as I said, the obstacle is the way. These are all kind of pointing to the same idea here. So let me move on. What's the other one here? Okay. Here's another idea that you'll find in ancient spiritual texts and also in modern day teachings. This is an idea that is really pervasive. In order to get where you want to go, you must first accept where you are. In order to get where you want to go, you must first accept where you are. So one way to think of this is maybe balance your attachment to the outcome with appreciation of the process, right? Like you're balancing your desire for a future event with gratitude for the present moment. Because if you give too much significance to the outcome and you don't give enough to the process, you get trapped in that endless cycle of unfulfilling achievement. And so when you're less attached to the outcome, things tend to work out in your favor, and it happens more frequently. And so this principle is pointed to by Andy Warhol when he says, he has a quote when he says, "As soon as you stop wanting something, you get it." And that seems to be like a good way to think of the balance between desire and gratitude. Desire for a future event and gratitude for the present. And then finally, the idea of creating your reality, right? This is kind of a nebulous idea, and it's a little bit woo-woo, but I don't quite know exactly how else to phrase it. It's just this idea of kind of mastering your circumstances rather than letting them master you, I guess. But creating your reality, whatever that means to you, it begins with the understanding that your outer world is really a reflection of your inner world. This is summed up in the phrase, "as above, so below." Like what you put out is generally what you get back. You attract what you want by being what you want, right? All these axioms, these kind of phrases, and others like them point toward the same principle. Eckhart Tolle expresses this concept really beautifully when he says, if you get the inside right, the outside falls into place. And again, this shows up all over the place. Marianne Williamson also says this in a different form. She says in one of her books, I believe it's in A Return to Love, she says, ego says, once everything falls into place, I'll feel peace. Spirit says, once I feel peace, everything will fall into place. It's this paradox of, again, accepting your circumstances in order to go beyond them. But it's also the knowledge that you can only get the outside right by getting the inside right. It's again, paradoxical because you want to work on the outside, but it really is a manifestation of what's going on the inside. So that's the paradoxical nature of maintain balance. And really, that's the end of my explanation of the ABCs of self-development. So I hope that makes some sense to you. Let me know if it does. Let me know if it doesn't also. Feel free to leave me a comment on my Instagram at Think Grow Prosper. Feel free to leave me a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening. Hey, thanks for listening. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes on my website at thinkgrowprosper.com/podcast. That's where I put all the links and resources mentioned in each episode. It's also where I put the outlines of topics covered, which is a really good way to refer back to episodes in the future. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to leave a review on iTunes with your biggest takeaway. I make it a point to read all the reviews. You can also screenshot this episode and share it to your social media along with something you learned or found interesting. And tag me in your post because I'd love to see what you found interesting. Say hi and thank you for your support.